OPB Podcasts.
From the Gert Boyle studio, it's OPB Politics Now for Thursday, October 16th. As we tape this, Oregon is still waiting for a court to decide whether or not President Trump can send National Guard troops into Portland. But as that battle plays out in court, the fight for Americans' hearts and minds continues in South Portland. On one side are conservative media personalities who've been granted eye-popping access to Trump administration officials as they broadcast a vision of ongoing protests as violent and dangerous. On the other, protesters who are actively lampooning that narrative with nudity and frogs and a lot more. Today, we're going to take a look at these competing visions. Welcome to the podcast. I'm OPB Politics reporter Dirk VanderHart.
Hi, I'm OPB reporter Alejandro Figueroa.
I'm OPB reporter Erik Neumann.
Great to have both of y'all with us today. Erik, I want to start with you because you recently took a look at the role conservative influencers and media types have been playing in these protests, really for months now. You led that story, actually, with a scene from Homeland Security Secretary Kristi Noem's recent trip to Portland. Why?
So I think that scene just sort of captured the effort to bring some of these outside social media influencers to Portland to kind of put their perspective of what's happening with the protests out to their social media followings. So like you said, Noem visited Portland. Along with her were four conservative social media influencers. The beginning of the story was with this gentleman, Benny Johnson, who lives in Florida. He was getting off the plane in Portland, met up with these other three folks in the area, along with Secretary Noem and different agency officials. They kind of were giving this play-by-play as they were arriving in Portland, talking about how intense it was going to be, hyping up the chaos and the arrests that had been happening here. Johnson at one point was in the ICE building doing interviews and making some rather absurd claims, talking about how the windows of the building had to be darkened because of Democrats shooting sniper rounds into the building. Definitely not something that I've witnessed in the times that I've been down there. And then the group was up on the roof, kind of scanning the protest area below. And that kind of felt like it's where the story started to fall apart, because basically you had about a dozen reporters who were down on the ground. One of our colleagues was down there. She couldn't get past the yellow caution tape outside the building. And then a few dozen protesters at different intersections, the ubiquitous man in the chicken suit. But really just the amount of drama kind of withered as soon as they were actually looking at what was happening.
Yeah, it was a pretty paltry, no pun intended, showing down there. And not the most impressive thing for Noem to look down upon. You're right. I mean, this was just one day in this now months-long protest. Obviously a notable day since the Homeland Security Secretary was in town. But, these right-wing commentators and media figures have been around this protest for a while now, sort of acting as really primary source material for Trump's insistence that Portland is this war zone that's on fire.
Right. There has been a pretty consistent counter-protester element at the protests themselves. I've definitely seen it the couple times that I've been down there. There's one of these folks, Katie Davis-Court, has posted on her social media in the past photos of herself on top of the ICE building. So it seems clear that this was not the first time that these folks were kind of granted this access. There's another guy named Nick Shirley who was filming when I was there. Another Nick Sorter, who was kind of filming some of these altercations that were happening. And I will say that this group of people, who I guess I'm referring to as social media influencers, they're the ones who are really kind of packaging content versus like filming things and packaging it and editing it and putting it out to their social media channels versus a whole kind of other contingent of people who are just streaming what's going on. They've got their phones up in the air on selfie sticks. It's kind of odd because you see these cameras just all over the place. And that other group of people is just sort of filming things in this raw, unedited format, still sort of chasing the drama as it unfolds.
Yeah, and asking for donations for their effort and all that. I mean, I think you're right. This is kind of a amorphous amorphous group. Like, people fall into different camps. I know you mentioned Katie Davis-Court. She works for the Post Millennial. It's a right-wing online publication out of Canada. I mean, she's really been down there, I think, since June, many, many nights when this was getting very little coverage. And obviously not a ton was going on, much of that, but has really been on the ground quite a bit. One of the things you get into in this piece is that really, in sort of a larger view, this isn't new, right? Particularly in the years since Trump was first elected, there have been these sort of pro-MAGA voices, counter-protesters that show up to protests held by left-leaning groups.
Right. It's not new that people from all political sides are recording protests on their phones and for social media. That was definitely an element of the 2020 protests in Portland. OPB has documented incidents and lawsuits, stemming from them involving members of, for example, the right-wing group Patriot Prayer, provoking confrontations that were filmed and put on social media. I would say overall, the scene down there right now is just sort of this chaotic environment where you have a range of people that are all sort of trying to antagonize the people that they disagree with. So that can include protesters who are antagonizing the federal agents at the ICE building, counter-protesters who are trying to get into arguments with those protesters, showing up, wearing MAGA hats, carrying American flags, trying to provoke arguments. And sort of obviously, like, there will be conflict when you have that sort of mix of people together. So I think the result is that viewers online are getting a perspective that can be pretty dramatic and maybe is inconsistent with just the overall tone of the protests themselves.
Well, yeah, and we should note, right, like back in 20 and 21, we actually saw actual violence in the street. We would see sort of left-wing protesters and maybe some conservative MAGA groups openly brawling. Sometimes they would shoot paintballs at each other. Sometimes they would shoot bear spray at each other. In one instance, actually, a right-wing demonstrator was shot in the streets of Portland and killed, and his assailant was later shot by police. So there was actual violence a number of years ago. This hasn't been anything like that. Yes, there is some chattering, there is some scuffles, but we just haven't seen anything like those really more concerning confrontations like we've seen in the past. The point being, we have long had conservative voices showing up, taping progressive protests, things like that. This still, what we've seen, I think, in the past few months and really the past few weeks, seems kind of novel, just in terms of how these folks are working so much in lockstep with Trump and his administration. I mean, just last week, we saw this White House roundtable, right, where a number of these very streamers you mentioned were sitting with Trump and a number of administration officials painting a picture of Portland as this really violent, dangerous city sort of run by terroristic anti-fascists.
Yeah, I mean, I think that is what is kind of interesting and a little bit concerning about what's going on right now is you do have these social media influencers who are getting special treatment from agencies like DHS to tour the facility, while other reporters like our colleagues here at OPB or at the Oregonian have not been let in, or they've requested access and been told you have to show us what your coverage is like of this situation before we'll consider it. And with the White House situation, a number of these people who were at the ICE building, then later on in the week wound up at a White House roundtable with President Trump, talking to him about the chaos in Portland. And like, if you look at some of the content that these folks have on their social media, it's completely promotional of the federal government. And essentially, some of it just looks like recruitment ads for ICE. So it's definitely a different tone than more conventional journalists would take. I asked kind of what's new about this collaboration between media personalities and the administration to a professor named A.J. Bauer at the University of Alabama. He studies journalism and media activism. This is how he described it for me.
What's different in the Trump administration is you have them, instead of inviting independent members of the press, inviting folks who share their worldview, media figures who do have decent-sized platforms, who can then go and convey the government's message for them in a way that is much more celebratory.
So these social media folks are kind of being used as a filter for the administration, as if they're practicing journalists, and the messages that they're putting out are being blended in with the social media content from the Department of Homeland Security, from the White House. While they were there, they, taped kind of promotional videos with the White House. The interviews that they've done are repeatedly, shared on conservative social media, ranging from Fox News to Newsmax to smaller outlets, as well as on their own podcasts. So I think the takeaway for me is that this narrative is really kind of distorting what's happening here in Portland. The size of the protests are being exaggerated. It still is just 2 blocks, basically right in front of the ICE building. And then it's worth thinking about how this fits into the larger message of deploying the National Guard. There's a legal fight happening, as you mentioned at the top of the show, taking place over whether the Guard can be deployed to Portland. One of the criteria for that is this legal argument that there's a rebellion taking place. And it certainly looks from a lot of the media that's being put out that the situation is more chaotic than it actually appears.
Well, it gets to what you said earlier, right? We see so many of these videos that are very tight framing. We're very close up against federal officers that are coming out of the facility to, for instance, like clear the driveway, right? And they'll be shouted at. Sometimes they'll push people. Sometimes they'll make arrests. But it's all very close. And it seems like your mind can kind of do this assumption where there must be a lot more people all around. But what Noam saw from the top of the building, right, is more in line with what it really is. There's a small cluster of people. It gets really loud. Some people are shouting and being rude, but it really is just not a big thing. I think that is exactly right. The other thing we haven't mentioned, probably should, is sometimes these folks we are talking about have not just been sort of broadcasting the story or offering a narrative about them. They have actually become part of the story.
Right. There was 2 of the social media folks who were at the White House who said they were assaulted by protesters. There was a third whose videos showed him kind of being chased. And it seems like that is kind of portrayed to emphasize the danger of the protests. Nick Sorter was one of the people who was actually arrested by police. He's one of the social media kind of personalities. Charges were later dropped against him. He's now suing the city of Portland. So these people are definitely becoming part of the story, which again is kind of unusual from, I guess, journalistic standards usually. One other conservative podcaster that I talked to there was a gentleman named Matt Tardio. He's more in this kind of streamer camp of just sort of like filming everything that's going on to show this continuous stream of the environment. He told me that he had actually seen people intentionally provoking protesters.
I do know that I've caught some coming up streamers or whatever they were trying to be actually legitimately trying to start problems and having hidden cameramen off to the side trying to capture those problems starting so that they can have their viral clips. That's messed up.
Wow.
I guess I bring that up because whatever your political background is, I think it's important to know what you're getting. And if there is appropriate context, if people are being provoked into conflict, if these folks are actually trying to make an effort to get multiple sides of a story, if they're independent and they're able to be critical of the agencies that are in power, a lot of these journalistic norms just don't exist right now. So I think the result is people are getting a pretty skewed picture.
Well, and some of these instances have led to new developments in the story. So, for instance, you mentioned Sorter, who got arrested. Now, I don't know all the details around why he was arrested. There was some sort of scuffle, but that then prompted Attorney General Pam Bondi to say, "Look, we're gonna investigate you, Portland, because we think you're enforcing the law in such a slanted way that you're being really biased against people who hold conservative views." I mean, they've taken on a life of their own in that way.
Sure.
Anyway, so that is one vision of these Portland protests, right? One that pretty much, we should say, every local official disavows. And now there is sort of this counter effort emerging that has offered an almost diametrically opposite view of what the city looks like. It's a lot more fun, I have to say. Let's start with the latest example of this. Alejandro, you had the immense honor of working this past Sunday. What were you covering?
A true honor indeed, Dirk. So I was covering the emergency World Naked Bike Ride. So it's probably one of Portland's most well-known protests. Started in the early 2000s to protest car culture, both the reliance of fossil fuels and unsafe conditions for cyclists. And it usually happens once a year at summer at night. But this one was a bit different. It was during the day, in the fall. And the reason for this particular ride is both the presence of the ICE facility in South Portland and also the President Donald Trump's plan to send the National Guard to the city.
You know, what I saw online was this tendency for people around the country who heard maybe about Portland holding this naked bike ride to sort of roll their eyes. Some of them seemed genuinely confused or to think this was an insanely random response, right? People in Portland, I mean, you just mentioned this. People in Portland will know this is pretty routine. Naked bike rides have been held for a long time, as you said, to protest the fossil fuel industry or car culture or, you know, unsafe traffic conditions. I have never seen one, though. I participated in a few. I have never seen one on a rainy October afternoon. It was cold. What was the mood like out there, Alejandro?
Yeah. So first of all, this was they gathered at the Oregon Convention Center Plaza, where, by the way, right across the street there was a college fair going on.
Okay.
But the mood, I mean, I would say it was quite joyous, despite the fact that, I mean, it was pretty chilly. I think it was in the mid to low 50s, and it was pouring rain, which is kind of odd for Portland. I feel like it just drizzles, but it was pouring a lot on and off. And it kind of felt like an extension of the opening scene of Portlandia, where you had people wearing clown makeup. Some people were wearing wigs. A lot of people were wearing costumes. There were people juggling. The Unipiper was there, which I found out. He has a Wikipedia page. I didn't know that. But for the most part, you have people that were naked, butt naked, but for the most part, people were. I mean, they were clothed. It was chilly. So people were wearing ponchos or some sort of clothes.
Yeah. A lot more clothes than might be typical in these. And you were talking to people on the ride. I mean, what did you hear from folks about why they came out? Why did they brave the weather? All that good stuff.
Yeah. So first of all, an interesting observation that I made was it was actually the first time for a lot of people that I noticed there. So it was people of all ages, young or some of them in their mid 50s, were coming up and showing up sometimes by themselves. And what I heard for the most part, and I think a lot of people might agree with this, I spoke with Desiree Argento, and she was there by herself. And she pretty much explains that this is kind of like the true essence of Portland.
Since Portland is allegedly on fire and burning down, and it's like a war zone, I figured the best way we could show who we really are is by expressing ourselves completely, and being naked is a wonderful way to say F you.
Yeah. And other people told me they were there kind of for the cause, but they also just wanted to have fun and be naked.
I mean, there is this really, I think, a strong feeling among many Portlanders right now to push back against this constant narrative we're hearing from Trump and his folks about how dire the situation is here and show that it is not that. And I think this protest went part of the way toward that. I will say not everyone was a fan of this strategy. Right. Here's U.S. House Speaker Mike Johnson earlier this week.
You know, most recently, the most threatening thing I've seen yet was the naked bicyclers in Portland who were protesting ICE down there. I mean, it's getting really ugly. They have attacked, physically assaulted officers. People have been arrested, okay? This is serious business. And ICE and the valiant, brave, patriotic Americans who step up to serve in these dangerous law enforcement positions deserve our respect.
I have parsed this quote a couple times. I think pretty clearly Johnson was being tongue-in-cheek at the beginning when he said, like, the ugliest thing I've seen is this naked bike ride. I think he got serious and sort of started adopting the more conservative talking point when he started talking about protesters attacking people. But I think he was just joking about the naked bike ride. But just to put it in context, right? This is far from the only thing that has injected some absurdity into this protests. Yes. I mean, in the last week or so, we've seen this explosion of protesters in these bulbous, colorful costumes. I mean, I've seen, chickens, dinosaurs, axolotls, pick a TV cartoon. There is a character from there. And of course, most famously, frogs. I think most people who watch the protests tie this explosion to this one protester named Seth Todd, who started wearing an inflatable frog costume to the protests not that long ago. That led to an evening of sort of absurd footage, right? There was this silly-looking bulbous, frog taunting federal officers. At one point, those officers sort of go into the crowd, purposely send pepper spray into the intake vent of his costume. Obviously, that struck a lot of people as wrong, but it's truly taken on a life of its own. And so we have now even seen people at ICE protests in other cities donning frog costumes. Just this week, actually, the Late Show with Stephen Colbert offered its own take on this whole situation. Here's what some of that sounded like.
You can spray us with pepper, but we won't surrender. We'll respond with a naked bike ride. So march our city. We'll stand up to fascists, the chicken, the T-Rex.
That, of course, is a parody of Kermit the Frog. He was called the leader of the frog resistance in that clip. And he was, that's a parody of the old song Rainbow Connection. Alejandro, Colbert is far from the only national media figure who has picked up on this silly aspect of Portland's protests and is really using it to poke fun at the president.
It's not. The Daily Show was there. And they were just talking to people. Probably, I actually was not near earsight or around them when they were interviewing people. But they certainly were talking to people. And I did commit a bit of a faux pas, if you might. We got there a little bit early, and when we got there, you usually tend to gravitate towards people that are reporters, media that you see. And so we walked up to them. I was there with our photographer, and I went up to the producer, and I think we just were chit-chatting. And I was like, at one point, who are you guys with? And she said, the Daily Show. And it didn't really process in my head, where it really took me a minute, and I kind of just made a joke about asking where Michael Barbaro is, thinking
of the Daily,
the
podcast,
and she looked at me kind of confused, and I was like, no. And I was like, man, you guys need this many people, because it really truly didn't process for a minute, and they had like a crew of 8 people, and I commented on it, and I was like, yeah, you guys need this many people for a podcast.
You didn't mean anything by it. I'm guessing that is not the first time the Daily Show has been mistaken for the Daily.
Probably not. I have not seen their coverage though of the protest.
Yeah, I don't think it's come out yet. We'll be watching for it. This levity that we're talking about, it continues. Actually, today, a colleague of ours, Conrad Wilson, came up to me and said he had passed the ICE building, saw a collection of maybe half a dozen elderly women knitting outside. The vibes continue outside the ICE building. But Erik, I wonder what reaction you've seen as you've sort of looked at the right-wing influencers and how they're looking at these protests. I mean, how have they been reacting to this movement toward the silly and presenting it to their followers?
I have not been able to get to the bottom of that question much. I have seen some mention that the costumes are a tactic to hide some of the more violent protesters' actions, but I will admit that I have disengaged from social media a little bit in the time since doing this story, so I don't have a great answer for you on that.
No, that's okay. I think I have seen very much the same thing. The reaction has been like, don't be fooled by the unicorns, everybody. These people within the unicorns are anti-fascist terrorists who want to attack federal officers. I mean, I think I've literally seen like something along those lines. That seems to be much of the response. Understanding we don't have all the answers, we will leave it there today. As I mentioned up top, we are all eagerly awaiting a Court of Appeals decision on whether National Guard troops can deploy in Portland. If the court decides they can, I think that's a development that could obviously change the tenor down on South Waterfront in a big way, and we will be watching. Thanks to both of you for coming on today.
Thanks for having me, Dirk.
Thanks so much.
This week's episode of OPB Politics Now was recorded in the Gert Boyle studio. It was produced by Andrew Thien, and our audio engineer is Stephen Cray. Our music comes from Audio Network. In these uncertain times, we are certain that you have questions about local politics or maybe inflatable frogs or right-wing influencers or naked bike rides. Maybe we can answer them. We would love to hear from you. Email us at opbpoliticsnow@opb.org. We'll be back next week with more political news from across the Pacific Northwest. Until then, you can find all of OPB's reporting, as always, at opb.org. Thanks for your support, and thanks for listening.